Hello and welcome to this gradient mesh exercise, which is going to be a visual telltale procedure on how to gradient mesh a face. And I'm going to use this poster that's in front of you that I created in Adobe Illustrator, which right now the poster is open in Photoshop because this is the print poster for high res that I sent to the client. But I want to zoom in to Han here, and I want to show you what Han looks like with texture on him. Okay, and then I'm going to take it apart when I open this in Adobe Illustrator, which I already have open. So I'm going to zoom back, and then let's just zoom forward on Leia. And you can see just how really possible it is in Adobe Illustrator to bring objects to life using a gradient mesh, and that it has a painterly feel because of the technique that I have incorporated, which I want to break down. Now, there are so many things that I probably will have follow-up movies to this on how to do hair and how to do different things like bringing the texture in, okay, because that's a whole nother aspect of a correlation between Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator in bringing in some of the texture that is within whatever reference you're using. In other words, Han has very specific pores on his face, so I used Photoshop to create the vector paths, and I just copied and pasted them into Illustrator, and I resized them, and then I put them on opacity layers, and you will see when I get there. But this is not about, the first movie is not about that. The first movie is just about how do you create a face. How do you break down the overall skin texture, and how do you break down the overall skin, and then the shapes on the face that actually make up the face. Okay, so we're going to talk in terms of how I'm going to break down. We're going to talk in terms of layers, what's on top, what's on the bottom, and what do you begin with. So I'm going to move right into Adobe Illustrator. So I may just, I'm going to hit the F key to put this back to full screen here like this. And I'm just going to put this on my other screen and hit Command 0 so I can refer to that. But now here is the same file, obviously, in the beginning stages, in the working stages of what the final poster turned out like. And there are so many aspects to Adobe Illustrator. In other words, I need to bring this back over. Do you see how I have faded out her, what would be her right arm and her left arm, and then I faded out Han from the shoulder and from the chest, and then I blended them together? That is possible in Adobe Illustrator. Okay, so here I didn't worry about that. So this is a working file. So I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to bring over the layer palette, and we're going to get started. Now, I've created an entire set of swatches that you can see here that have to do with the brown tones in the hair and the face and the skin texture, the skin tones, but that's, again, not why we're doing this particular movie. Okay, this movie is how do you break down a face. So what I want to do is I have Han open. You can see the layer palette right here. As a matter of fact, I should probably go to the panel options and make the layer palette large icons here so you can see what I'm actually doing. And let me move that up and over to this side. Now I'm going to turn Leia's layer off, and I'm going to zoom in to Han. And this is going to take, it's a heavy file. By heavy, I mean it's a lot of memory. Okay, now I'm going to get right into the face. So I'm going to open up Han, and I'm going to, you see, have everything locked, and I'm going to zoom in first right to Han so you can see. It's going to take a minute, but you can see that I have a texture layer. Let me make the layer palette a little bit bigger. I have a texture layer that I'm going to turn on and give it a second. The texture just popped on the face. I'm going to turn it off. I'll get into the texture in a second movie or in a third movie. I'm not sure which yet, but you will see. Now I'm going to zoom back out, and it's going to take a minute to zoom back out because I'm going to turn everything off. And that's another thing about Adobe Illustrator is when you're working on something that is this memory intensive, because gradient meshing can be memory intensive, don't keep layers on that you don't need. All right, now by this time you should know what a clicky copy is. So I'm going to flip on the upper reference layer that is a composite of many photographs that I put together in Adobe Photoshop. Now, I was originally going to put this as the composite with the Millennium Falcon and Han and Leia on the bottom with the Star Wars, but that's not what I really wanted to do with this in the end. But I still use the composite. Here, I'll zoom in. I still use the composite for texture. So I made a pretty high-res composite of images that I got from Star Wars, okay, and I put it together because, and I have the expression, your artwork is going to be as good as your reference. So try to get the highest res reference you can, and I'm going to turn off the clicky copy now, which is my top layer, and you can now see what I used to generate the shapes that make up Han. And I did some creative license on his hair, but again, you have to realize that this is a stylized interpretation of Han. All right, so I'm going to zoom in to Han, and actually I'm going to turn off the clicky copy, and I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to break it down into his face. Then I'm going to start removing layers, but I'm going to remove it from this distance, so you can see right now that I'm going to remove his back hair and his neck. I'm going to leave his face layer on. I'm going to remove his top hair and his large body of top hair right there, and I'm going to remove his coat so I don't have to deal with it, and his shirt so I don't have to deal with it, and I'll maybe get into those shapes as I work them, but as I work into this tutorial movie. But let me take away the thin top hair layer, and then let's I'm going to take away the forehead lines, and I'm going to take away the upper. I'm going to zoom into his face now, and let me turn on the thin the forehead lines just so you can see what I'm talking about. I actually made an opacity back. I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but I'm going to unlock it and go into this, and I'm going to show you that I actually made a layer just of forehead lines, and when you see a gray filled circle over here in the layer palette, it means that the group or the subgroup, which all of these are paths within a parent layer, have been opacityed back. Now I opacityed these back to 4%. Let me put them back at 100% so you can see that if I click away from it, you can see they're very harsh. All right, so I want you to always think in terms of detail on something like a face as being a filled, saturated layer. Did you hear what I said? If it's white, or if it's a light value, fill it a lot whiter or lighter than you need. If it's a dark value, fill it with a lot darker than you need, and then use opacity to create a beautiful blend with whatever texture or color is underneath. So I'm now going to Command Z or Control Z back that, and you can see when I click away that these forehead lines just blend into the face beautifully. I'll turn them off and on so you can see how they actually react. So when you see something that's very light on the screen like this, let me zoom into that, please consider that that is light because it's, well, it's a dark value, but it's blended so you can see through to the tone underneath. And I want you to always consider that it's best to go lighter or darker fully and use opacity to have beautiful color within the value. Now, I am going to say one more thing based on what I just said, because there's a million things I want to tell you. I'm going to try to get to this. But I'm going to go back, or I'm going to show you back at 100% what this would have looked like. That dark is a saturated dark. It's not black. It's black with color in it. All right, and that's very important, because if I opacity back this value and I have only used black in that value, so what I'm going to do right now is bring over the color palette. I just want to, actually I want to test and see if I'm correct or not correct. So I'm going to grab I for the eyedropper, and I'm going to grab that value. Now what I did was I went into that value and I turned that value, let me double click this. See how that is a color black. See how I've gone into the color of that black right here, and I made it a red black. Don't think that this over here is really the value. It's actually over here, and I'm going to click OK. So that black is a red black because the face has reds in it. So when I opacity it back, I don't want it to be a gray value on the face. I want it to actually be a hue or tint that blends with the face. I'm probably saying that badly, but I don't care. I'm going to hit 4 on this, and you're going to see that 4% was the percentage that I actually used, but I'm going to turn off the forehead lines. Now let's get right into what this was about. So there's so many things I want to share with you. All right, but now I'm going to remove, let me zoom in, I'm going to remove his actual face from this because I want you to see what it is to build to the top shapes. And I'm going to try to go, I'll do it this way, then I'll do it backwards, and then we'll explain it. I'll explain it as I go. All right, I'll try real hard. So the building of a face is very important. And I want to talk about it by showing you the face in the composite layers that I made. But so right now, let me turn off the eyebrows. Let me turn off the eyebrow hair, if I can find it right there. And now let me go right into the Han right eye and Han left eye. And I'm going to turn off right now the upper mouth and the lower mouth. And then I'm going to turn back on the face. Now I'm going to turn on the clicky copy so you can see something. When I see a face that I have to do, and I included the nose in this gradient mesh because it was possible to do so. But just like I turned off the eyes and the lips, I could have actually put the nose in a different gradient mesh, a smaller gradient mesh that you can see that I'm actually rotating around. But in this case, I didn't have to. So I'm going to explain as I move on through this how you build a face. So I'm going to turn on the clicky copy, and I'm going to keep on turning on the clicky copy throughout these various stages. So when I see that face, I have to have right here on the clicky copy, I want you to ask yourself, I didn't say that right. I want you to look at this face, whatever face you're looking at, in terms of that you don't see the eyes, you don't see the mouth, and you don't see, in some cases, even the nose. So you only see the skin texture. So you will understand what I'm talking about when I actually now turn off the clicky copy, and let's now go to the original face that I made. So I'm going to open up the face layer, I'm unlocking it, and I'm opening up the face layer. I'm going to lock up the forehead lines. Now I want you to look over to the right and see how many faces I actually created. I'm going to unlock all of these faces, as you see that I'm doing right there, and I'm going to turn off the final face that I created, and I'm going to turn on the beginning face that I created. So I'm going to be moving up and down on this layer palette. Now, and we're going to talk about construction of gradient mesh lines. Now, in talking about construction of gradient mesh lines, I have a PDF file which a lot of you have already seen, some of you have not, and I'm going to bring it over to the screen here, and I want to remind all of you, or tell you for the first time, when you build a mesh, and I'm going to zoom into this PDF file, and let me click this button. Okay, you mostly start out, not fully 100% of the time, but most gradient meshes, including the face, start out as a rectangle. And then you turn the rectangle in the direction of whatever shape you're actually going to paint. In the case of this cap, the colors are going from the upper left to the lower right. So I turned the construction or the direction of the rectangle there. I then used the U key, which is the gradient mesh tool, and I put in a center line on the rectangle from the upper and from the east-west side, from the north, south, and east-west side, if I can use those terminologies. Before I did that, however, I colored the whatever shape I'm using with the middle value, and it doesn't necessarily mean 50%, but with the middle value. So I used the eyedropper and I colored the rectangle, in this case, which was a green. And you can see that over here when I show you that I actually colored it with green. Now, from this point on, in almost any file, I'm going to leave the clicky copy on as I start to create these sets of lines. Now, when you have the center lines in, can you see how I'm actually moving the upper left corner, the upper right corner, the lower left corner, and the lower right corner into a position that is going to match the outer geometry of whatever shape you're working on? In this case, his hat, but in our case, a face. So let me now move over to here, and you can see how I've actually now made the outer lines of this mesh match the parts that were important to do. The part underneath here I didn't have to match because all of Mario's face was going to cover up the actual mesh. Okay, so I didn't have to worry about matching the geometry of this line that I'm actually making right here. And this cap is broken into several shapes. It's broken into a shape here that can include this little upper rim of his cap, and then the cap itself. So I'm going to move now over to this one, and you can see here how I'm actually now using the clicky copy on. All right, this is actually the faded view of the lower clicky copy, which was the bottom layer, which I set to an opacity, so I can actually see where the gradient mesh lines are. I'll show you what I mean when I'm working on Han, so don't get all panicky there. But now you can see that I actually turned the clicky copy off, and you can see that I've added the left line beyond the center line. I've added a left construction line, a right construction line, a top construction line, and a bottom construction line. Now that allows me the freedom of creating all the interior lines and getting closer to the color movements within the shape, because I laid out the mesh properly. Now, I saved different mesh versions as I move through a file, because every time you add a line to a gradient mesh, it creates more complex geometry. You don't ever want to only have one gradient mesh, and I'll show you what I mean by that right now. So let's take this simple thing which goes from a center line. Look what I'm doing again. It goes from a center line right here, center and center, to left, right, bottom, top, and then all the interior geometry can then pretty much be clicked pretty simply and moved. Although when you get complex with the face, it's not going to be that simple. But I'm going to put this back on the other screen, and I'm going back to Han. Now, I'm going to click on the circle over here to the right to show you my geometry, and I colored this red because it was easy to see, but it's not easy to see on camera. So I'm going to double click the parent layer, and I'm going to change this. If I make it black, we won't see the lines through here. So I'm going to try to find something that's going to work, and I'm not sure yellow is going to work, but I guess yellow works fine. But now you can't see the outer mesh here. All right. Now there is a trick. I need to find a different color. There is a trick that I'm going to try to explain, and let me first find, because I can't walk and chew gum at the same time. That should work. That blue should work. Now I want you to see that on the first mesh, I actually have a center line that I'm showing you. I'm actually clicking the center line right now. I'm actually drawing on top of it. And here is the center line running through where his nose area is. So let me turn the clicky copy on so you can see what I'm talking about. Now, look at how I actually generated. That's going to be hard to explain, but I'm going to explain it. Look at how I actually generated my gradient mesh to match the right-hand geometry, the left-hand I said that backwards. I really didn't. If I'm talking about his face, this is the left side of his face, okay? But as far as the camera goes, I'll say this is the right side and this is the left side. So I did construct the center lines first, then I hit the left line, the right line. The top line and the bottom line right there where I'm actually showing you to lay out the important geometry on his face. Now you're going to ask right away, but Brian, look, let me hit the A key for the direct select and let me go back to clicking this. Okay. You're going to ask, well, why did you make his face bigger when his face is actually drawn right here? The answer is that in a gradient mesh, if I were to have used the actual line of his face as like I did on Mario's cap, all the lines would converge on the bottom and it would get way too complex to try to match those lines. So to his face, to try to have room enough for all the lines that need to go in. All right? I shouldn't show you what I'm talking about, but I will. I'm going to turn on the final one. And I'm going to click on the gradient mesh for the final one. Now that is a final gradient mesh, but that happened many versions later. Look at the complexity of this bottom. Let me zoom into the bottom so you could see what I'm talking about. Look at how many lines are on the bottom. Now could you imagine that all of those points would have had to go on the bottom of his chin? So there's a trick when you're doing something complex like this. All right? And let me turn that off so we don't see it. Now, the trick is to make it slightly bigger than you need, meaning make the rectangle, the original rectangle, I'll go back and I'll click on it, make the original rectangle, here are the top corner, top left, top right, there are the original corners of the rectangle, and here is the bottom left and the bottom right. Now, inside of this, I'm actually going to open it up. I created, and I'm going to unlock it, I created a clipping mask of his face. Do you see it selected? Okay. There's a really beautiful thing, and let me turn off the clicky copy so you can see it. You think that the gradient mesh visually just goes over to this line, but I'm going to actually go down here and turn off the clipping mask. And that's a screen display. Let me zoom in so you can see what the real thing looks like. Now, my mesh actually went over to here, but all I did was create a path above my mesh. I'll turn it on, and you can see the shape of it. Now, when I did the mesh, and I did that shape, as a matter of fact, what I should do is just, I was going to say I could make a copy of that clipping mask. Let me see if I can do it on screen for you, and click it, and then make a new sublayer inside of this. I'm going to make a new sublayer right here, and I'm going to put this extra clipping mask inside that one right there. So now I'm inside layer 57. The reason I did that is going to be hopefully simple to follow. Now let me turn this to blue so you can see it. Now I'm going to hit the E key and I'm going to move that over here. That's just a shape that is his face. Okay. Now with that on, I'm going to actually take it and make sure it does not have, and I hope I won't confuse you, but I'm actually going to make sure it's not a clipping mask. Now, when you make your rectangle, always make it bigger than you need. Okay? In fact, let me turn, for the moment, let me take this clipping mask and put a stroke color on it so I can see it on the screen. Okay? So now let me move this someplace. Now, here's the rectangle. Now I'm going to color. I'm going to use the eyedropper, and I'm going to color a middle value in that rectangle. And I'm going to put it below the path. Now, look over here. You can see that this is eventually going to be Hans's face. This is the clipping mask, which is going to clip the color that I'm going to make around it. Now, I'm going to do something very quickly for you to show you what I'm talking about. But I'm not going to clip it yet. I'm going to turn off the clipping mask in a minute. But I'm going to take the U key and I'm going to put in a center line to the face and a center line to the face right here. Now, that allows me to take the direct selection tool. I'm going to hit A and then U so that my toggle on the Command or Control key can be the direct select. Now let me move this slightly closer to the eventual clipping mask. Let me turn this into the shape that it needs to be eventually. Okay, meaning this is going to be a really well done, not this particular thing I'm working on, but eventually this one over here to the right was. But let me now move this in. Let's take this and put it up here. Let's take this and get it close to that face right here. And now let's turn the geometry. My finger is not letting go of the Command or Control key as I am in the Gradient Mesh tool. Okay, that allows me access to my Bezier handles. Now, can you see how I've actually made this rectangle a little bit more doable? Let me actually widen it on the bottom so that I have more space for all the lines I'm going to put in. Now, see over here how I actually now started with a left line and a right line? Okay, let's pretend that I'm adding the left line and the right line to this mesh. So I click very close to this one, there's my left line. I click very close to this one, there's my right line. Now let's zoom in and let's hold the Command or Control key. Let's take the handlebar and make it thinner, because you never move a gradient mesh line without retracting the handlebar. And let's move this over to this side. Let's click this point and let's retract the handlebars to make them shorter. Now watch what I do, and I'm going to move this over to this side. Now do you see how I can actually start building the geometry for this face? Now let's move up and let's grab the geometry for here and now make it come over to match the left hand side, and now let's make it come over to match the right hand side of the tone changes that are in his face. Now if I could, I can show you that over here. Let me turn on the clicky copy over here. Do you see how if I zoom in, the left line and the right line match the middle of the tone changes? See how this right here matches that beautiful reflected light on his right side? This matches that dark value on his left side. It's not his left side, but it's our left side for him. And then this matched the geometry of the face of the forehead wrinkles, and this one here matched the geometry of the shading. That was going to be a stopping line. This is actually going to be a color that's going to stop the dark color. Eventually I'm going to have a line come right through where I'm actually showing you that is going to dictate where the bottom line goes, but you will see that when I go to the next mesh. Now see how I started the geometry? This is where I made the decision that, hey, I can actually make his nose part of his original mesh, which to me was cool. I really liked trying to do that. But this is where I dictated all of that. Now, I'm going to turn off the clicky copy, and I'm going to show you that when I flip it back on and off, please look at where I eyedropped all of these points. So when I wanted to get a color in this general area, I clicked, I hit the eyedropper tool, I turned on the clicky copy, and I eyedropped that tone. Then I held the Command or Control key and I clicked and I eyedropped that tone. I didn't care what other little detailed changes were inside of here. The rule on a gradient mesh is, when you're doing something complex like this, color as you go. Please understand what I just said. Color as you go. Now, if I color that one dark and I color this one, that tone right there, I realize the dark is going to go to the halfway point. I don't care. All I know is when I put in that line, I can eyedrop the color eventually, which will force the dark back over to the left. Did you understand what I just meant? So let me turn off the clicky copy and see how the dark goes halfway over to this one. But at least I have a beautifully colored yet simplified version of his tone in his face right here. Now let me turn on the clicky copy and show you what I'm talking about. Look at each point that I'm turning off and on. They are the correct colors at this time. Now let's move back over to this guy and let's clip this mesh. I should put in the bottom line first. So let me put in a bottom line to simulate this bottom line here, and let me put in a top line to simulate this. Now here's what I want to tell you. It's kind of important. Let me turn on the clicky copy. Never click, if you can, inside a mesh. Always click the outer part. Now watch how I'm going to take this. I could have made it this one or this one if you're asking. Okay, eventually. But look at how I'm going to take, and I'm going to click away from this. Look at how I can take this tone and advance it to the position where it's angling up where I know I can click. Now the line's going to go straight across, but at least I'll have it on the left and right side in the correct area. See how that goes straight across? You just have to move the points down. So I'll show you what I mean over here. Let's turn off the clicky copy and let's go to this one. Now let's say that the color, right here, let me pull a guide down. Let's say that the color actually, whoops, I gotta turn on guides. Let's say that the color actually goes from this point and goes down across this way and up across that way. You don't want to click right here because then you'd have to move 2 points up. Did you follow what I just said? Why don't you click the mesh with the U key over here? And now that you've clicked it, look at how you can actually now take this. Let me zoom in. Retract the handlebars. I'm sorry, but this is what geometry is all about, and move it down like this. Now what if this one had a forehead line which went down like this? Let's retract the handlebars. Now let's pull this handlebar out to start what wrinkle would be in the face. Let's just pretend I'm making it move up. Now this one, let's retract the handlebar and let's put it down where the geometry should be. And now do you see how I can actually now make clean geometry come straight down? I should actually take this one and make it go like that, and make sure that this has good geometry like that. Now look at how I've made a forehead line which has beautiful geometry to it. Now let's eventually build for a nose. So now what if the nose came down like this and I had a little nose wrinkle just like that? Now look at how I've actually positioned that for the nose. Let's go back over here and I'll show you that's what I did for his nose. Now let's turn on the clicky copy and you can see where I positioned that. I positioned it somewhere because I knew that I was going to need geometry to go in this direction. Please understand that. Now let's go do the chin. You can either use this line as what your bottom line was, or any line. In other words, let's talk about the darkness for the bottom. Eventually I'm going to have a color line. I'm zooming in right there. Eventually I'm going to have a color line of dark right here. Do you follow what I mean? And it's going to go straight across out to here. I just chose, and it didn't matter, but I just chose to have this be the light line. So then I call this a stopping line. Now let's go over here and make the decision on this little guy. So now let's take in and let's follow that darkness right to the edge. Let's take the U key and click straight across. Now this is where I want the geometry to anchor itself. In this case, for this guy, I have to move this one up and I have to go into this and fix the geometry for over here. So I'm going to take this, I have to locate that little point right there and fix it. Whoops, that wasn't it. Let me Z back. It was this one right there. So now I have to take this handlebar and start that geometry by fixing it. Now let's take this one and move it up and over. This one should probably have moved over that way. And now let's click and let's now make this geometry sweeter. Now let's take this and make it come out for what would eventually be, see how I'm doing that? See how I can actually now relocate that geometry? What would that have been for? It would have been for this line or this line. And in this case, if I turn on the clicky copy again to show you again, it was for the light value. Now, that was a pretty good explanation of how to initialize and do the basic geometry. Now, let's make the clipping mask. With this, I'm going to unlock the actual little shape that I made. So here's the clipping mask. Let me move in. Look at how beautiful that is. It matches his face. Now, let's hold the Shift key or the Command or Control key and click on the mesh. Now I have both selected. If I go to Object, Clipping Mask, and Make, it's going to clip out the rest of the shape. Now you have to go into the clipping group, and because you never want to turn this mask that I'm turning off and on, and again, don't look at the edge, it always does that. If I zoom in and zoom back out, it'll be fine. Look at the mesh itself. Look at how clean that is going to make it. Now, Illustrator makes it possible to have a clipping group, but to visually turn off the mask and lock it, because I don't ever want to turn, look what I'm clicking on. I don't ever, or showing you where it is. I don't want to click on that shape and make it into a gradient mesh. So what did I do? I locked it. Now, I'm going to start on the next movie because this one's already pretty long, and I'm going to call this movie number 1. Now let's now break the face down into the different versions that actually finally get to the shading that I need to get to before I can start all the detail on the face. So go to the second movie.